there's no way of helping that is too small. There's tons of things that every single person can do to help other people that are in these situations. And that can be as small as just not judging.
Oh, wake up, rethink the status quo. When you get your money right, then you're the one who runs your life. Come build a wealthy spirit with Sammy and Michelle.
October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and Sammy and I are so excited that we were able to bring on Rychelle, an expert in this space, to talk about the financial barriers for people who find themselves in abusive relationships or domestic violence situations. Financial independence is so important to me. We obviously talk about it on this podcast a lot, but a lot of times we'll talk about it in relationship to retiring early or getting out of your job, having FU money in almost a lighthearted way. But I think such an important part, like for us growing up, was the message of being able to be financially independent, be financially knowledgeable, so that unfortunately you could protect yourself from getting in a situation where you might be financially stuck with an abuser. And so I'm really excited about this conversation with Rychelle because we're going to go through things that people who end up in these type of situations have to consider, what you can do to get yourself out of that situation, or what you can do to help anyone in that situation. Let's get into it. Rychelle is a relationship coach who is completing her PhD in criminal justice with a focus on domestic violence and sexual assault. She's worked as a victim's advocate at domestic violence shelters and has done community outreach with young people, teenagers, kids around prevention. She has a publication called Navigating Relationships, where she writes about ways to help women live their safest, happiest, and healthiest lives, as well as a YouTube channel focused on helping people build healthy relationships. We are so thrilled to have an expert like Rychelle here with us today. We're excited to deep dive into this topic so you can know how to empower yourself if you find yourself in this situation or help others around you. Welcome, Rychelle. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited too.
This is such an important topic, and I'm so excited we're able to just connect and have a conversation around all of the different tools for people who find themselves in or know people who are in a domestic violence situation. I wanted to start with understanding a little bit of your background. Tell me about how you got into working with people experiencing domestic violence.
It kind of just happened by chance. After college, I had worked at basically a juvenile detention facility, and it was just such a stressful job that one day I quit and didn't really have another job lined up or anything. So I was without employment for a little bit, and one of my friends at the time had worked at the local domestic violence shelter, and she had worked there for a little while, and she was like, "Hey, I know you're looking for a job. We have part-time work available, basically answering the crisis hotline, and we can get you in and just to be something." And honestly, even though my undergraduate degree was in criminal justice, I had no idea that domestic violence victim advocate was even a thing. Like I didn't know that there were people whose literal job it was to help people in these situations. It ended up being the best by chance thing that could have happened because as a teenager and young adult, like high school and college for me, I was in my own abusive and controlling relationships. And so it ended up being this thing that, even though at the time it was just a part-time, hey, here's something so you have some sort of income, it ended up being one of the most rewarding and passionate things that I could have done. And it kickstarted the path that I'm on now. So it was just kind of by chance. And I went from part-time crisis hotline phone answering and making sure that new residents had intakes and were doing everything that they needed to do and that they had everything that they needed. Then I moved up to a full-time position and it was the youth services coordinator, where I actually had two roles. I was the youth services coordinator and kind of like the shelter manager. So making sure like the shelter was fully stocked with everything it needed and any kind of maintenance that needed done. That was my job. But my more rewarding job and my favorite job that I had there was the youth services coordinator, where I would go around to like elementary schools and middle schools and community events and do like prevention presentations to the kids, to the teachers, and just do like community outreach.
It's funny how the right things can find us without us even knowing it. I also want to talk about, with this being Domestic Violence Awareness Month, there's so much related to personal finances that might surprise people. It's actually a huge part of getting stuck in these situations and also trying to find your way out. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, like really to help us understand like the gravity of the finances for somebody who is in a domestic violence situation.
Yeah, so just like some quick facts. Domestic violence in general, regardless of the type, because there's, physical violence, psychological violence, like all those different subtypes of domestic violence. But domestic violence in general affects 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men. And those numbers aren't even accurate because it is one of the most underreported things. So those numbers are actually probably a lot higher. With financial abuse, whether that be financial exploitation or financial restrictions that keeps them from leaving, those occur in 99% of domestic violence cases that are reported.
Wow.
So pretty much anyone that experiences domestic violence experiences some sort of financial burden, restriction, or exploitation in conjunction with the other types of abuse they're experiencing.
Which makes sense because a lot of times people are in these situations because their abuser is being pretty intentional and making someone financially dependent on them, making somebody feel isolated, making somebody feel like they can't support themselves, even just making you feel like you don't know what you're doing. All of that can help contribute to making you stay because you don't feel like you have the power to get out of the situation. There's a whole emotional aspect to it, but like you said, like the financial aspect is not unintentional. Like it helps create a dynamic where that person gets more and more stuck.
For sure.
Yeah, I completely agree, Michelle. I think with someone, especially where control is a big aspect, finances is just such a, it's almost like that's going to be such an easy target to manipulate somebody in that way.
For sure. And it's, there are some things that are kind of more, I guess I'll say obvious in that like maybe they restrict someone's finances. A lot of abusers will give their victims an allowance. So like they won't allow them to have a job. They won't allow them to have any credit cards or bank accounts in their name. And so they're dependent on their abuser for an allowance. And usually that allowance is barely enough to pay for the necessities. There was one woman at the shelter where she actually so her abuser would give her an allowance. I don't remember what it was. Maybe it was like $50 a week or whatever. But anytime she would get change back from groceries or anything like that, she would actually stash that away in a tampon box.
Oh my
so
gosh.
She would like take the tampons like out of the plastic, out of the applicators or whatever, and she would stash like $1 or $2 in a tampon because he wouldn't look there. He wouldn't think that, oh, there's probably money hidden in there. And
Right.
She did that for months, just saving like $1 at a time in this tampon box. And finally, like it took a long time, like probably over a year for her to save up enough to actually leave. But she was just taking $1 or whatever, because like she had to give him back any money she didn't use, but maybe she could stash like a couple of coins or $1 here, $1 there. So it was just a very slow process, and just the mental burden that had to be for her, in that like she had to do this so slowly and deal with the abuse every day. In addition to the allowance and not being able to have a job, there's things like maybe the victim loses their job because their abuser doesn't let them go to work or doesn't let them use the car to get to work or shows up at their work and causes a big problem. So then they lose their employment. There's even more of like a long game kind of deal where maybe the abuser doesn't let them go to class if they're in college and doesn't let them go to school. So then that impacts their ability to even get a job in the future. So it's just all of these different aspects that just compound into just making their circle and their ability to do anything smaller and smaller and smaller.
It's interesting too, because especially doing this podcast and talking to so many people about personal finance, a lot of people just don't know a lot about personal finance. And so I don't think it's on any person for ending up in that situation and not necessarily even realizing it at first. Because you could be in a version of that that's not abusive. Like some people, I have friends where one partner pays all the bills, one partner takes care of the mortgage, they don't know how to sign into any of the accounts, and they're in secure, loving relationships. But if they weren't, they would still be in the same situation. Like their partner just also isn't abusive. And so I think a lot of that is because we don't necessarily have, like a lot of people just don't have that financial literacy period. And if somebody is thinking 1 or 2 steps ahead of you, it can be so easy to get in that situation. So I definitely want to emphasize too, especially as you're growing up, especially as you're young, but really even people our age or older, like sometimes we're just not that aware of our finances. And sometimes it feels nice if somebody knows more than you do. You're like, oh, perfect. I don't even have to think about that. Like you'll just give me the money I need to spend. You'll help me budget. And that can turn ugly and then you can be stuck in a situation. So it could definitely happen to anybody. When it comes to finances, what are really the struggles that people who are trying to get out of these situations, what are they running into?
So a lot of people in these kinds of relationships, they're in survival mode, right? They're just trying to make it day to day. So it's a couple of different things come into play. Sometimes they can't even think that far into the future because they're just trying to survive every day. So they can't think, oh, well, if I save money for the next couple of months or at this rate, in 6 months, I'll be able to leave. They can't even think that far into the future because they're just trying to make it through that current day. And so that's a big part of it.
Yeah.
But the other issue is just plain and simple, without any kind of assistance, things are expensive, right? So things cost so much money. A few semesters ago, I taught an undergrad class on victimization and domestic violence. And one of the things I had them do as a project was a sort of simulation activity. So they had to take on the persona of someone trying to leave an abusive partner, right? And I gave them their whole scenario. They had 3 kids at different ages. A couple were in school. One needed daycare. They had a dog that they weren't willing to leave behind because pets are another one of the biggest reasons that victims will stay in an abusive relationship, because their pet is either a major coping mechanism for them to get through the abuse, or their abuser even threatens the animal, like, if you leave, I will do something to this animal. So the scenario involved a dog. And then the first part was that I had them lay out the cost of leaving and getting their own apartment and daycare and groceries and literally everything they would need without any assistance. They couldn't ask friends and family. They couldn't use any kind of assistant programs or anything like that, because isolation, like you mentioned earlier, is another big aspect of domestic violence. So a lot of these people trying to leave feel like they have to do everything completely by themselves. So just playing that activity out a little bit, I think the current average rent in the United States is somewhere around $1,500, right? And obviously, depending on where you live, that's going to change. I think here in Austin, it's closer to $2,500 or something like that, because it's just a really expensive city to live in. So if your rent is $1,500 and you have to pay a security deposit, you have to pay application fees to even apply for these apartments. And then you have your utility bills. And I think the average utilities in the United States is somewhere around $400 to $600, depending on usage and all the intricate details or whatever. And then you have to furnish your apartment. You have to get daycare for your kids. You have to pay the pet fees and pet deposits for any kind of pet. So you're looking at, without any assistance, to get a place on your own and continue to provide for yourself and your children. You're looking at $4,000 to $5,000 just right off the bat. And that's not including the recurring things like rent and utility bills. That's a lot of money for someone that doesn't have access to credit cards, that doesn't have their name on their bank statements, that doesn't have access to any income because they're not allowed to work. Then even if they have that amount of money, even if they save it, even if they stash it away, then anytime they're applying for an apartment, they have, credit checks. They need to provide bank statements. They need to provide proof of income. And so if they don't have any of those things, they're not going to get approved for an apartment or a house if they're trying to rent. Even if they're trying, even if they're actively ready and willing mentally, which is the biggest hurdle they're going to get over, is mentally getting ready to leave. Even if they're ready to do that, they will hit so many roadblocks if they try to do it completely by themselves without any assistance. And that is just so defeating that a lot of times they'll quit trying, or they won't even try in the first place because they know they're going to hit those roadblocks.
That exercise is such a good exercise because even as you're speaking, and I'm thinking about my own situation, and when we were looking for an apartment last year, if I'm not making 3 times rent, not even enough to pay 1 month's rent, my income has to be 3 times rent, I can't get approved anywhere. I would need a guarantor. If I need to access my bank statements, that might trigger my, emails to my partner. A credit check, that's something that could trigger an email or, a warning, or you need a text or something, your OTP passwords, those type of things. Like, I can see how, like, even just thinking about that, like, even getting the first step, even just having the time to go and look at apartment.
And if you don't have access to transportation, how do you even go look at these places? How do you print off all of the documents you need? How do you fill out the applications and have them in your possession without your abuser seeing it? And there's just so much that goes into it.
Yeah, Rychelle, and even just hearing you say this, then I'm thinking about maybe they'd have to go to Craigslist or, like maybe more shadier forms of housing. And if you're a mom and you have 3 kids, you might not want to risk that kind of scenario where, your children may be in a worse situation because you're under the table kind of thing.
Or I know smart people who they'll go look for an apartment in Craigslist in San Francisco and they'll literally lose out on like $500 just because there's predatory behavior. They don't know what they're looking for. I mean, I think Sammy had a friend once who actually went and saw a place, put a deposit down, and it turned out to be fake. So I agree with your point there, Sammy. It's like there's already so much you have to like know and filter when you're just looking for housing. And then like the pitfalls that you can't even consider, it's super stressful.
And so for people in this situation, are there any resources or any tips you have for finding housing?
For sure. So everything that I just went through, like the rent, the utilities, the moving truck, if you have furniture that you're trying to, like literally everything you would need, your local domestic violence organization is probably going to have some sort of assistance program or their own grant that they can just pay for it for you outright. And the issue there is kind of twofold. One, a lot of victims still feel a lot of shame and embarrassment that they found themselves in this situation, that they were stuck in this situation for so long. But to your point earlier, it's so hard to see that you're in this situation because it's not like an immediate, oh, this person's abusive. It is a slow process that they will just kind of build and build and build. And then you're so deep in the trenches of domestic violence before you even realize that you are. So the shame and the guilt, this is easier said than done, but the shame and the guilt can just go right out the window. There's no shame, no guilt. I said how many people are affected by it. So we know that it is a thing that so many people experience. So reaching out to your local domestic violence organization is going to be the biggest weight off of any victim's shoulder, because a lot of them are in secret locations that it's really hard for the abusers to find them, or you can still use their services. Even if you're not willing or able to go stay at the shelter as a resident, you can still be sort of like a outside client, basically, and benefit from their resources. So they have programs to help with rent, whether it be reduce rent or completely cover your rent for a certain amount of time until you're able to get back on your feet financially. They have programs for utility assistance. And even if the shelter itself doesn't have those programs, utility companies, or there are like state level assistant programs, that there are those kinds of benefits that can help you reduce your utilities and things like that. There's grocery assistance. There's programs that you can get complete furniture sets donated. I think big box store like furniture. I don't know if you guys are familiar with like Ashley Furniture. I think they have a program.
Yeah.
I think they have a program where like you can be basically nominated and you'll receive like a child's bed set if you have need for like a complete bed frame, mattress, whatever for your kids. And so there's all kinds of programs, and they even have grants through these organizations that will cover any kind of transportation. There was another woman in the domestic violence shelter that I worked at. She finally, it took the whole 3 years that I worked there. She was a client off and on, coming back and going back to her abuser, because another quick statistic is it usually takes anywhere from 7 to 9 times for a person to finally leave their abuser for good, for all of these various reasons that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But so she finally got up the nerve and the bravery to leave. And she was like, I need to get to a different city. I need to move, to this city 3 hours away where my mom lives. I need to go stay with her. But I don't have a job. I don't have any way to pay to get up there. So we paid for a bus ticket. We bought her a bus ticket and we put her on a Greyhound bus up to this city. And so these organizations have grants and financial donations. There are people that will literally make donations to these organizations every year and say, like, this donation is to go for bus passes. Like, use this money that I'm donating to buy a stash of bus passes so that your residents can have transportation to and from work. Every state has domestic violence organizations. Every state has a state level coalition. And then under that coalition, every state has several domestic violence shelters. And every one of these shelters, they might not have exactly the same resources or services, but every one of them, this is their literal purpose, is to help people get out of these situations. And housing is a big one. A lot of, I think every domestic violence victim and person trying to leave is applicable or eligible for rapid rehousing, which basically gets them quicker housing, so you don't have to wait in like the Section 8 line for months and months or years at a time to finally get a space. Rapid rehousing is a lot quicker of a process.
There's a few things there that you said that I think are so important, whether you're in this situation or you know somebody who's in this situation. One, I want to highlight just the shame and guilt associated with it. Or even, I think when you're in this type of situation, it's very easy to maybe think your situation isn't that bad compared to other people based off what you're hearing or what you saw growing up. And you're like, well, my partner sometimes might hit me, or sometimes maybe they don't hit me, but they're just critical. Or you can sort of rewrite the narrative in your head, because I think it is hard to actually, like, to say I am in a domestic violence situation feels like the most extreme way to label something. But I love that you like encourage people to just think through that, especially if you find that you're stuck in a situation and you can't find a way out, because being able to acknowledge that, I'm assuming, is at least the first step in being able to start to like understand what resources are available to you. The other thing is that I don't think I even realized how much support and resources they are. Like, I've heard of these nonprofits and, kind of generally know that they support like women or people in these situations. But the fact that somebody can help you with your housing, get you a bus ticket somewhere, help you quickly move. And to be honest, also probably just have done this so many times that they know all of the things to consider is so powerful. And I think as somebody who gives to different charities, it's also really nice to know like your dollar has a major impact in getting somebody out of these situations.
A couple of points to go along with that is even someone like me who has worked as a victim advocate for several years, when my students did this project, because the second part of this project was to, okay, now do the same thing, but find 5 organizations or assistance programs that can help you reduce that cost, right? And they were finding resources that I didn't even know about. I was like, I was reading through their assignments and I was like, oh, that is such a cool resource. I didn't know that existed. It's just, there's basically a resource for anything, right? So that's another thing that kind of goes along with the guilt and the shame is that if you need something, ask if there's a way to help with it. Like ask your domestic violence advocate at the shelter, hey, this is the next thing I need to do. Is there anything that can help me with that? Because there are programs that can help get kids into a new school or like anything like that. And there's just so many resources that people aren't going to be familiar with. And it's fascinating that so many of these things exist. But also at the same time, it's almost like I wish that they were almost advertised more so that people could be more aware of them. But yeah, even as someone who worked in the field as an advocate helping victims, there are resources that even I didn't know about.
That's a great point because I think this is true in general about any type of financial situation you find yourself in. A lot of times if we're able to vocalize what we need, we might actually find out that there are resources out there that can help us. Even if you just think of like a generic example, like paying for college. A lot of times that there's a lot of financial assistance or someone might know of a scholarship that's unfamiliar to you. Same with people who need money for food or for housing. I think until you need it, you probably aren't too aware of it. And I like what you're saying, because I'm sure also in those situations, like if there's something really specific you need that feels unique to you, 1, chances are someone else has already been through that experience. Or 2, they're probably willing to be creative and support you in what you need, or maybe can like find a solution even if it doesn't exist yet.
And so what are some other costs that maybe we're not considering that people who are leaving their situation have to consider?
Maybe not costs, but even though every state has various domestic violence organizations, they're not always in the most convenient locations. For example, where I worked there, we covered 5 counties with my organization that I worked at. And so the next closest shelter was 30 to 45 minutes away by just regular car. The issue that a lot of victims run into or survivors at that point run into is that if their abuser finds out that they're at the shelter and somehow learns the location, because even though we try to keep it as secret as possible, it's impossible to keep something completely off the radar. So sometimes their abuser would find them at the shelter, and so they couldn't stay there anymore because it was no longer safe for them, it was no longer safe for the other residents, and it was no longer safe for the employees. And so we would have to get them to another shelter, which meant 30 to 45 minutes away. And if they had a job, maybe they're no longer able to get to that job if they're at those other shelters. So then they would have to make that decision of, okay, well, do I want to just leave the shelter and stay in this area? Do I want to go back to my abuser and keep this job? Do I want to move to this other shelter that, if they even have a bed available, do I want to move to this other shelter and have to go through the process of finding another job? Or do I want to figure out a way to make that commute back here and keep my current job? And so it's just, there's so many layers and so many different things that even after they leave the situation that they have to continue to consider. But also, Michelle, you mentioned earlier that sometimes like your abuser isn't even really physically abusive, right? Like they might not be hitting, they might not be even really controlling. And the issue gets even more complicated when there are kids involved. So even if maybe they're just like, and again, this isn't like downplaying the minor domestic violence. Like it's still a terrible situation that people don't deserve to be in. But sometimes it's just maybe their partner pays for their kids' school or pays for their kids' health insurance, or they're just financially dependent on them because of their children. And so they feel like they can't leave because if they leave, they will lose that financial assistance for their kids. And even if they do physically leave, if their abuser does let them leave, they're still financially linked to that person because of the children.
Yeah.
There's this one woman I know, like she is divorced and she has moved on. She's married to another guy and they're in a great healthy relationship, but her ex is paying for her kid's school. And her kid has been in private school her whole life, so she didn't want to pull her from that and put her kid in public school. She just wanted to keep things stable and consistent for her daughter. So she kept her in that private school, but her ex was paying for school. So that meant that she couldn't move, she couldn't leave, she couldn't go anywhere else. She is still financially linked to her ex, who was not a nice guy, because he was paying for their daughter's school. It's such a long-term thing. Even if they completely leave their abuser, they're still trapped. They're still stuck if there are kids involved.
And I know sometimes those situations can involve things like even just like getting a divorce is not cheap, or getting a restraining order is not cheap. Do you know if there's resources to help with that kind of thing?
Absolutely. Again, I can't speak to every area because I'm only familiar with the region that I worked in, but I would assume that they have similar programs or something like adjacent to it. But like where I worked, every domestic violence victim or survivor was eligible for free legal representation through legal aid. And sometimes legal aid isn't necessarily the best because those lawyers are very overworked and have so many cases, but it was still a resource compared to a divorce lawyer who charges thousands of dollars an hour because they can. But they had access to lawyers through legal aid, and they had access to, mental health counseling through local organizations. I think it was through Goodwill, maybe. They had access to counseling, so they didn't have to pay for mental health services, even if they didn't have insurance or anything like that. And protection orders or restraining orders, they never cost anything. Like they don't come with court fees. They don't have any kind of cost attached for the victim. Oftentimes, one of the conditions for a restraining order will be that the abuser has to pay the court fees or has to pay the victim a certain amount, but there's no fees for the victim themselves. The victim advocates through the organizations can help with every single one of those things. They can help get them set up with legal aid. They can actually go to the courthouse or the police station and file the form for a protection order. They can attend court hearings. They can't speak on the victim's behalf at these protection order hearings, but they can be like a comfort, a security blanket almost. They can be just a warm presence there to make the process a little less scary. But yes, all of those services are free for the victims.
That's really helpful to know too, because I think just even, especially if you haven't been managing that kind of stuff, and then for anybody, this is something brand new. So there's just so many, like, even just legal steps, and just knowing that entire process, it's good to have somebody who that's their job, is to help people with this every day.
Yeah, and now there are like still financial burdens that come with those things, because they might need to take time off of work to go to their court hearing or to meet with their attorney or anything like that. But that is kind of going along with the shame and the guilt. Like, I don't want to say that employers have to work with them, but they're probably going to be much more willing to work with them if they say, hey, I'm in this situation. I have to go to a court hearing. can I miss my shift? Can I take this day off?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's great to know that there's resources like that. I know, like, working in the clinic, people who are in this situation, I'd be like, do you want me to write you, like, some leave for, stress, anxiety, that kind of thing? Because that will give you some time to, like, be able to go to all these hearings and stuff without getting penalized by your workplace. I'm not saying necessarily that everybody, like, does that, but that could be a possible option talking to your healthcare provider, too.
For sure. There was one more point I wanted to make about housing, though. So we moved to Austin a little over a year ago, and I noticed in my lease when we were reading through it that there was a section that said if you find yourself in a domestic violence situation or a family violence situation, that is a way to void your lease. That is a way you can terminate your lease. So that was the first time I ever saw it in print in one of our leases, because we lived in a few different states. That was the first time I had ever seen it in print. And so I looked into it a little more. And in Texas, they do have that as a part of rental agreements. The only issue, and there's really no good solution to this issue in the current moment, but the only issue is that you have to provide your landlord with a police report or a protection order or a letter from an advocate. So you do have to be like actively reaching out for assistance with this situation. But again, there's really no good solution to that. There's no way around that just yet. But outside of Texas, I haven't fully looked into this yet, but there's a federal grant called Violence Against Women Act, or the VAWA. And I believe that the same thing works under VAWA. If you get a letter from a victim advocate, you can terminate a lease as a domestic violence victim advocate, because that's another big housing burden and housing issue, is that these victim survivors, they feel like they can't leave because they signed a 12-month lease. They feel like they can't just up and leave, or they would have to pay out the remainder of their lease, or they're just legally stuck. They're legally binded to this lease. But that's not necessarily the case. It might take some finagling. It might take some nuanced navigating, but there's always a way to get out of a lease like that for those kinds of situations.
Yeah, and just another emphasis on contacting the domestic violence shelter and getting in touch with the victim advocate, because I know so many people who are like, I don't want to get the police involved anymore. Or like they call the police. They feel like that's useless. They're like, I already tried. Everything's done that can be done. And it's like, no, like you can reach out to one of these centers, and they may be actually more familiar with how to deal with these situations, as far as like lease agreements and legally, and helping people like actually get out of something when they're feeling like they have no options left.
Yeah, and a domestic violence organization's never going to make you file a police report. They're never going to make you call the police. Like, they will help you. They'll talk through all of your options with you and like help you play out what that path looks like. But they're never going to say, in order to be our client, you have to file a police report, because that is just another form of control and abuse that isn't okay.
Right. I think with housing too, of course, it depends person to person, facility to facility. But even when you're talking about breaking your lease, I think COVID was a great example of how people were just like, yeah, I'm not doing it. Or they talk to people, or they talk to their landlord, and they're like, hey, this is my situation. Would you be able to give me an exception? And I think that's like one of the powers of like knowing a personal finance, and knowing like, even if you don't necessarily have a right to it, people actually might be open and willing to work with you in your situation. And I know that can really, again, depend on who your landlord is and like where you are. But for example, we had a friend who recently just had to break her lease here, not related to domestic violence, just based off her situation. And it's pretty clear in our contract that you have to, pay 2 months rent and all of that stuff. But the apartment complex was actually pretty willing to work with her to figure out a situation. So I think also like sometimes that even if the legalese says that you're locked in for whatever reason, sometimes if you are able to build a relationship or ask people for these things, they might be able to just be kind and help you out. Like, I think sometimes we can be surprised at how many people out there want to help us.
And Rychelle, I wanted to ask you too, because you mentioned how a lot of people, they don't necessarily know they're getting into a domestic violence situation or controlling situation when they first enter a relationship. And I think there's probably things we can do to set ourselves up just from the beginning so that we're protected if we're being just mindful about finances. Some things to think about so that if we do end up in the situation, maybe we have like a little bit of safety net or something to protect us.
Yeah, that's true. Is there anything you can do just as a person wanting to protect yourself? Maybe you're not in the situation yet, but just being mindful, like steps that you can take.
One of the things I mentioned is that abusers will often not let you have your name on any bank accounts or not let you have any credit cards, or maybe they do the opposite. Maybe they make you have all of the credit cards in your name so that it affects your credit score. So just being mindful of that and just kind of keeping that at the forefront of your mind, and just always have some sort of financial pool, whether it be a bank account or an investment portfolio or something that is solely in your name with nobody else's name on it. Nobody else can access that money. Nobody else can have any kind of authoritative power over that money. And I know like sometimes that seems a little bit taboo, like, oh, I'm in a relationship with this person. We should have joint money. We should have like what's theirs is mine, what's mine is theirs, and that kind of thing. But it makes things so much easier in the long run. Like even with my boyfriend and I, like we have never once been in an abusive situation. We've been, very healthy from day one, but we don't have joint bank accounts. Like we have our own separate bank accounts, and that just makes things easier just from all fronts. And so just keeping something that is solely yours and not letting anybody try to like sweet talk you or manipulate you or threaten you into changing the status of that account. And if they try to be like, oh, well, if you really loved me, you would put my name on the account, or you would, join it with my account or whatever, then that's your first red flag that this is going down a path that I don't want to go down in my relationships. This is starting to go down an unhealthy path that I need to be mindful of. I'm not necessarily saying that those are abusive situations, but that, calls for a conversation. It's like, okay, well, why do you want your name on my account? Why do you think we need a joint account? And maybe they're receptive to it. Maybe they're like, oh, well, I just thought it's what you're supposed to do. I just thought it's what's expected. But maybe they start to escalate, and then maybe it is a sign that it's abusive. And then that can be your, okay, this is an unhealthy relationship. I need to get out. I need to not be in this relationship.
I love that advice. Even in general, like I think that we care so much about things like financial independence. A lot of times we talk about it in terms of financial independence for your job or, just being able to retire early. But I think for both Sammy and I, growing up, seeing a lot of people like within our culture, like women, a lot of times are very dependent on the man, or even vice versa. A lot of people don't have a lot of money, don't have a lot of knowledge about money. And to be honest, a lot of times the culture doesn't encourage you to leave those situations. A lot of times people will downplay them. And one thing our mom always told us was like the importance of being financially independent, as in being able to take care of yourself. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily hear. And doesn't mean that you have to be jaded about relationships, but I think it was a helpful framework to be like, okay, like sometimes just knowledge is power. Like knowing that somebody could take advantage of you in that way can help you protect yourself a little bit more. Not to say you could know the smartest people with money have stories where they get scammed, where they end up in these type of situations. So I don't necessarily think it prevents you from anything, or that anybody who ends up in that situation didn't know. But at the same time, to your point, if you are even able to like you're in a new partnership and you're able to have those conversations about money with your partner, and you're able to communicate like, hey, like I feel more secure and safe if I can have at least my own bank account, or these are the type of things that I need, boundaries that I need to set in the relationship that help me feel safe and secure and I love you. And I think if you can have a conversation around that and you are two people who care about each other, you can find a compromise that works and can still give you an out if you need it. It doesn't even have to be an abusive situation. Like so many people just stop loving each other and they get a divorce. And that is, Sammy always says the biggest, what is it?
The number one financial, the thing that most commonly destroys people financially is divorce, I believe. A different phrase, but
I think divorce is a lot more expensive than people realize, especially if you have kids, especially if you have unequal incomes. Depending on what state you're in, you could be paying alimony. So regardless, like having a divorce is a major financial impact on people. So I think, regardless, like going into a relationship and talking about money and understanding that if for some reason this doesn't work, having your money together could put you in a really tough situation.
Yeah, and one other point that I wanted to make is that sometimes we've been talking this whole time about sometimes it's the abuser that's controlling the money, the abuser that is supporting the victim. The victim is financially dependent on the abuser, but sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes the victim is financially supporting the abuser and they feel like they can't leave because then their abuser won't be able to make it on their own. They don't have a job. They don't have an income. They don't have anything. And they're, what's keeping them from being on the streets or whatever. And while compassion is like one of my biggest traits, I love helping people. There's a point where it's not good. It's not healthy. There are unhealthy levels of compassion. And this is definitely one of those things where, especially if your partner is abusing you, especially if it's an unhealthy or a toxic relationship, you as a victim are not responsible for your abuser's stability. I think that's really important for so many people to hear is because they're like, well, I do love the person because even though they're abusive, there is still love there, which is, we could do a whole nother episode on just that as a concept.
Right.
But even though there are still loving feelings there, at the end of the day, they are abusive. They are controlling. They are manipulative. And your safety and your stability is thousands times more important than staying with them to support them when they're abusive.
So true. I think it's a gift to let people deal with their own consequences sometimes. Yeah.
100%. And I think we've seen even more of that, when the way our culture is set up is a lot of like women were able to get visas and stuff to the United States because they were the ones who were nurses or would become the breadwinners in their family. And unfortunately, Indian culture is still, the male dominates, even if the woman is making money. And a lot of those situations can turn abusive. And I don't think it's uncommon that you're in a situation where your partner is not working. They're dependent on you. Maybe they just, they can't keep a job for whatever reason. And I feel for people who are in a relationship where you feel like making someone deal with the consequences of their actions is going to really hurt them. But I like what you said, where it's also like, at the end of the day, you're just enabling them. Like, they're never going to get better if that's the case too. And a lot of times what you see is that when people actually do have to deal with their situation, they can figure out a way out of it.
Yeah, Rychelle, this has been a really great conversation. I think we hit on a lot of important aspects that maybe people don't think about: the housing, the transportation, the legal aspects, and all the resources that are available to people through places like domestic violence shelters and victim advocates and things like that. Anything else you want to say to our audience, or a final thought for this episode?
There's no way of helping that is too small. There's tons of things that every single person can do to help other people that are in these situations. And that can be as small as just not judging, just being a person to listen to, right? Domestic violence affects everybody, like all socioeconomic statuses, all races, all genders, whatever, but it disproportionately affects, those in poverty and minorities because they don't necessarily have the support systems that, people who are more financially stable might have. So even just being someone to listen to, not judging them, believing them when they say that, hey, I think I'm in an abusive situation, because a lot of times people won't necessarily think that they're lying, but they just might struggle to believe them because they see the abuser, they see the face that the abuser's putting on. And so they don't see the abuse happening. So it's harder for them to grasp that it might be going on. being there for them, being a support system, and just donating to your local domestic violence agency. And that doesn't have to be like a monetary donation. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. Like anytime you are getting rid of a piece of furniture or clothes or food even, call up your local shelter and see if they could use it. See if they have anyone that needs your mattress before you throw it away. See if they have anyone that needs your dresser. See if you're trying to get rid of your car and you don't necessarily want to sell it. If you can donate a car, like we've had people donate a vehicle to our shelter before so that someone could use it to get to work. And so there's tons of different things that you can do. If you've got leftover food from a party, maybe your local shelter could use it. Like we had, sometimes like people would bring leftover cupcakes from their kid's birthday party. And that made the residents' day because, they're still just trying to make it from day to day. Or maybe they had kids and they could give their kid a cupcake and it was like a little piece of light in one of the darkest times of their life. So there's no donation, there's no assistance, there's no help that is too small or, oh, well, I can't really give a lot, so it's not really going to make a difference. It definitely does.
I love that because I think whether you're in this situation, you have a neighbor, a family member, a coworker, I feel like a lot of people talk to people at their work about these type of things. And you might be thinking, okay, how can I help? Is there anything I can do? Or maybe I don't know anyone in the situation, but I feel moved to give to this cause. I mean, even for me, hearing this conversation and hearing how the dollars get put to work, you're like, amazing. Like, I can see how $20 can actually turn into a bus ticket or a meal. Or there's 1,000 little things that when you're in this situation that come up, especially monetarily. And it's cool to know I can make a little bit of an impact with whatever I can give, whether it's time, money, food, resources. To your point, you could probably call them up and even ask them what's the most important thing that they need because nobody knows better than the organizations themselves.
For sure. More often than not, the things they're going to need the most are toiletries. Older kids' clothes is really big because a lot of people like always think like donating like baby items and like smaller children's clothes, but there are sometimes teenagers that come with their parents to the shelter. So a lot of like things that like older kids could benefit from are things that they don't usually have a lot of.
Rychelle, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. We wanted to close with giving you the opportunity to share. If people either want to follow your work or even work with you. I know you have expanded just within the space of healthy relationships as well. And so people want to work with you or if people want to find you, what are the best next steps? And we'll share everything in our show notes as well.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned that I have my newsletter. It was called Women Empowered, but I've recently changed it to Navigating Relationships. It's just a Substack publication. And then you mentioned my YouTube channel. My whole purpose, because I'm not a certified victim advocate anymore, but I'm always going to advocate for victims for the rest of my life. I'm just doing it in my own sort of way now. So my whole purpose right now as a relationship coach and creating the content that I create is I need this information, I need this knowledge to be accessible to as many people as possible, because that's how we change the world, right? The more information that gets into people's hands, the more they can benefit from these resources. The crisis work, the emergency services is all so important, but if I can help people learn about healthy relationships and how to recognize unhealthy versus healthy relationships and how to be in a healthy relationship and how to get out of an unhealthy relationship, if I can help them learn all of those things, then just maybe they won't find themselves in a domestic violence situation, or if they do, they'll be able to pick up on it sooner. I was in my controlling and abusive, I was in 2 back-to-back. And if I was in those relationships for 6 years total, and I didn't have the knowledge, I didn't have the people in my life outside of my family trying to help me see those relationships. And so basically I'm just trying to be the person that I didn't have. And I'm just trying to help people learn how to have healthy relationships, because if we learn how to have healthy relationships, then we can avoid unhealthy relationships from the start.
Thank you so much, Rychelle. It was so wonderful and helpful to have you on today. This was such a lovely conversation. I read your writing, I watch your videos. I do find it to be super helpful, super positive, supportive. And there are some things and stories that you share where I'm like, oof, yeah, I feel seen. Like sometimes hearing it from somebody else helps you recognize it in your own situations too. So really love the work that you're putting out there. And for anybody who wants to learn more about navigating relationships, we will make sure we have all the information for if you want to connect with Rychelle. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Takeaways.
Takeaways from our conversation with Rychelle. First of all, I really appreciated everything she had to say around that initial cost of getting out, the housing, the utilities, the moving, and that the domestic violence shelters victim advocates can actually help with this process.
I agree, Sammy. I think it's so helpful to just think about the exercise she had her students do for yourself, to really think about, like, if you had to leave your situation right now and you had no additional resources, how would you do it? When I'm thinking about it, I think about how difficult it was to find an apartment without any of those problems, how I needed to have 3 times my income, how I needed to be able to pay an application fee, to run a credit report. It really helps make you realize how many little things you have to think about just financially in terms of getting out of a domestic violence situation.
I also like how she discussed the legal fees, the cost of a divorce, the lack of cost of a restraining order, all these different legal trials that people come up against when they're trying to leave their abuser. This is one of the things I would hear about all the time in clinic. And it's so awesome to know that these domestic violence shelters have things like victim advocates, and they can help people when they're going to courts and things like that. Even just helping navigate this entire process, because if you're someone who hasn't had to manage any of that, and all of a sudden you're having to figure out how to legally escape your situation, it's nice to know the resources that are out there. Also, I like how she brought up setting money aside for ourselves. No matter who we are, what our situation is, it is important to have a little bit of cash just for us, our own personal emergency fund, to use in case we get into a bad situation. That is freedom.
100%. And there are so many reasons you should think about that, because when you do join in a partnership with somebody else and your finances, your lives, your children become more and more interconnected, if for some reason you have to leave that situation, even if everything is good, it is messy and it can be a financial burden. And it's just helpful to be able to have those conversations if you're in a healthy relationship and be able to make sure you can do what you can to not get stuck in a situation financially.
And I loved all the advice she had for just being there for people, an unbiased ear for people when they are going through these situations. And if possible, there's other ways to help. Donating things. If you live in the Charleston area, there's my sister's house, which is a very well-organized domestic violence center with lots of resources, including shelter, education, court advocacy, counseling. And they have a great website where they literally go through all the different ways you can contribute. Regular donations,
Uber gift cards,
Amazon gift cards, the types of things that they need donated most urgently. It's very clear. And from Rychelle's conversation with us today, I really appreciate it. It's just so utilitarian, like what you give will be used. And that's just so refreshing.
We will share Rychelle's information in case you want to check out her newsletter, Navigating Relationships, or her YouTube channel. She is a great writer. I really enjoy the stories that she shares from her personal life. She has both things you can do in these type of situations and also just really helpful tips from her own healthy relationship, things she's learned as she's grown. I highly, highly recommend it. And if you have any comments, if something here made you think about tools or resources that you would want people to know about, we would love to hear about it. buildawealthyspirit.com. You can comment on the show notes for this episode.
And most importantly, be sure to join us next week as we put down the rulebook and we rethink the status quo.